Empress Thessaly Vor of the Ardine Crown, gripped the arms of her ceremonial throne, so hard the ancient gold cracked beneath her fingers, watching on the great viewing dome as the shimmering distortion above her homeworld peeled away to reveal a single vessel. Not the refugee craft her scouts had promised. Not some desperate scavenger ship, but something vast and quiet and utterly unlike anything in the Empire's 11,000-year archive of known warships, its hull marked only with a small, unassuming insignia and the words Earth Fleet Reserve, VSL-3, and as her entire war council stood frozen in the throne room, unable to explain how something that size had slipped past 3 layers of planetary detection completely undetected until the moment it chose to be seen, Thessaly understood with a cold certainty settling into her chest that whatever came next, however this day ended, the empire she had inherited from 11 generations of Vor rulers was about to be forced to answer for something it had done, and that no amount of throne room grandeur was going to save her from that reckoning. But none of this had begun that way. It had begun 9 days earlier, when Ardine border patrols intercepted a fragile, unarmed human transport called the Selene Mercy, limping through contested space with barely functioning engines, carrying 412 refugees from a human colony that had been quietly, deliberately annexed by an Ardine mining consortium 18 months prior. An annexation the Crown had authorized in secret, believing humanity too scattered and too weak to ever notice or object, and had ordered its border commander, a rigidly loyal officer named Kest Orun, to seize the crippled ship, confiscate whatever resources it carried, and quietly dispose of the refugees before word of the original annexation could ever reach wider human territory. A command Orun carried out without hesitation, boarding the Selene Mercy and marching its exhausted, starving passengers into a detention hold, while privately reporting to the throne that the matter had been handled cleanly and would trouble no one. What Orun did not know, and what would unravel across the following days into the single greatest miscalculation in Ardine history, was that the Selene Mercy's captain, a soft-spoken woman named Yuki Tanaka, who had spent the crossing quietly memorizing every detail of her captor's procedures, uniforms, and command structure, while pretending to be nothing more than a frightened, broken civilian, had managed in the chaos of boarding to slip a single, encrypted, distress beacon into the detention hold's ventilation system, a beacon that carried not a plea for rescue but something far more precise. Coordinates, timestamps, and the exact identifying marks of the Ardine vessels responsible, transmitted on a frequency reserved for a fleet humanity itself rarely acknowledged existed even to its own allies. 3 days later, in the quiet officers' mess of the Ardine border station, Kest Orun received a routine sensor alert he initially dismissed as equipment malfunction, a single contact, massive in scale, according to gravimetric readings, but somehow invisible to every optical and electromagnetic scan available, holding position at the edge of Ardine space for exactly 6 hours without moving, without communicating, without doing anything except simply being there, patient as a held breath, and it was only when Orun's own scientific officer, a nervous young woman named Prela Das, cross-referenced the anomalous gravimetric signature against restricted historical archives, that she found a chilling, decades-old classified report from a rival empire describing an almost identical encounter, one that had ended with that empire's entire border fleet disabled without a single shot fired, and its ruling council quietly, permanently removed from power under circumstances the report deliberately left vague. That report, buried and half forgotten, was the first thread the Ardine Crown pulled that made them realize, far too late, that the ship above them was not a mystery to be solved, but a verdict already rendered. Thessaly, upon receiving Prela's frantic escalation, made the first of several catastrophic decisions that would define the coming days. Rather than opening diplomatic contact, she ordered her home fleet, the pride of the Ardine military, and the largest concentration of warships in the Crown's history, to surround the Anomaly and demand its immediate withdrawal. Convinced that overwhelming numbers would force whatever this was into retreat, the way every previous threat to the Crown had eventually folded, The truth stunned the entire galaxy in the hours that followed, because when the home fleet's 47 warships closed formation around the still, silent human vessel, its response was not aggression, but something far stranger. A single transmission, translated flawlessly into Ardine high speech, broadcast not to the fleet commanders but to every civilian channel across the homeworld simultaneously, a woman's calm, unhurried voice stating plainly, 412 human refugees are being held in violation of an annexation your government never disclosed to its own people. We are not here for war, we are here for them. You have 1 hour, and as those words reached every household screen and public terminal on Ardine Prime at once, Thessaly watched in horror as the very foundation of her crown's authority, built for 11 generations on the assumption that the throne alone decided what its people needed to know, cracked open in real time before an entire planet's disbelieving eyes. The Council had made a terrible mistake, and it was becoming impossible to hide it, because within minutes, Ardine citizens who had never heard the word annexation applied to a human colony began flooding every public channel with confused, furious questions, and Thessaly's most trusted advisor, an elderly statesman named Corvain Thess, who had served 3 Vor monarchs faithfully, turned to her with an expression she had never seen him wear before, not loyalty, but genuine, unguarded fear, and said quietly, "Your Majesty, if that ship can broadcast directly into our homes without triggering a single defense system, it did not need an hour. It is giving us one anyway." A realization that landed in the throne room like a physical blow, because it meant the human vessel's restraint was not weakness or uncertainty, but a deliberate, almost surgical choice, the kind made by someone who could have simply taken what she wanted, and chose instead to offer the crown one last chance to do the right thing on its own. Thessaly, cornered and desperate, made her second catastrophic decision, ordering the home fleet to open fire the moment the deadline passed, rather than risk appearing weak before her own subjects. A command fleet Admiral Dorsavel, a battle-scared veteran, who had spent 30 years building the home fleet into the Empire's proudest achievement, carried out with visible reluctance, watching her own tactical displays with a growing nauseous dread, as the countdown reached 0 and 47 ships, unleashed everything they had at a single, unmoving vessel that had not raised a single shield in response. What happened in the next 4 minutes would be studied by military historians across a dozen empires for the rest of the century. Because rather than destroying the human ship outright, every single Ardine weapons system, one after another across all 47 vessels, simply failed to fire. Not damaged, not disabled by any detectable countermeasure, but rendered inert as if some vast, invisible hand had gently closed around each weapon and asked it, politely, to stop, and Admiral Vell, staring at readouts that made no scientific sense, understood in that moment that her entire fleet's survival had never actually been in doubt, because the outcome had never actually been a contest. The human ship's voice returned then, quieter than before, almost weary. "I told you I wasn't here for war, I meant it. But I will not let you hurt them either." And it was in that single sentence, more than the impossible display of restrained power that preceded it, that Admiral Vell felt something shift permanently in her understanding of what strength actually meant. Because every doctrine she had ever been taught insisted that power unused was power wasted, and yet here was an entire fleet's worth of firepower, rendered meaningless, not through weakness but through a choice she was only beginning to comprehend. Aboard the human vessel, Captain Yuki Tanaka, who had spent 9 days as a supposedly broken refugee memorizing every detail of her captivity, now stood on a modest, unadorned bridge beside the vessel's actual commanding officer, a quiet, graying man named Fleet Reservist Elias Cho, who had been quietly monitoring the Selene Mercy's distress beacon since the moment it activated, and who explained to Yuki, in the calm, unhurried tone of someone who had done this before, and hoped never to need to again, that the ship beneath them, the Meridian's Grace, was one of only 3 vessels remaining, from a nearly forgotten reserve fleet, built during humanity's darkest post-collapse decades, specifically to protect scattered, undefended colonies from stronger powers who assumed isolation meant helplessness. Its defining technology, not a weapon in any traditional sense, but a field capable of neutralizing hostile intent at the molecular level of a weapon's firing mechanism, engineered deliberately never to kill, because the engineers who built it, survivors themselves of atrocities humanity, had suffered when it had no fleet at all, had sworn that whatever they built next would never become the very horror it was meant to prevent. Nobody knew what the human was hiding until that explanation reached the Ardine throne room through captured, decrypted fleet communications, and Thessaly, listening to the philosophy behind a technology that could have annihilated her entire civilization, and chose restraint instead, felt the last of her certainty collapse. Because it meant every assumption her crown had built its power upon, that strength existed to dominate, that mercy was for the weak, had just been publicly, catastrophically disproven in front of her own people, 3 hours after the failed attack. With her fleet humiliated but unharmed, and her own advisors quietly abandoning her in the corridors outside the throne room, Thessaly made her final decision, the only one that offered any path forward at all. She ordered the immediate release of all 412 human refugees, the public disclosure of the illegal annexation, and formally requested to speak directly with the human captain who had spent 9 days pretending to be exactly what her captors expected, only to reveal, at the precise moment it mattered most, that she had never actually needed rescuing at all, only patience and an open channel. When Yuki Tanaka finally stood before the Ardine Empress in a private audience, neither side had ever imagined possible. 9 days earlier, Thessaly, stripped of the confidence that had defined her entire reign, asked the only question she had left. Why give us the hour? You could have simply taken them back and left us to face our own people's fury alone. And Yuki, looking every bit as tired as the calm, unhurried voice that had shaken an empire, answered simply, because the people you hurt weren't the ones capable of learning something today. I hoped you might be too, and it was that single, quietly devastating sentence, repeated afterward across 100 worlds that had once measured strength only in what they were willing to destroy, that the galaxy would remember long after the home fleet's failed attack had faded from memory. Not the impossible cloaking, not the disabled weapons, not even the fall of a throne built on secrets, but the simple, unforgettable truth that the greatest power humanity had ever wielded was never its restraint alone, but its stubborn, patient willingness to believe that even an empire built on cruelty might still choose, given the chance, to become something better. In the months that followed, the Ardine Crown did not fall, though it came closer than any of the 11 Vor monarchs before Thessaly had ever imagined possible. Instead, under pressure from a populace that had watched their own government's secrets broadcast into their living rooms, the throne was forced into the first genuine reforms in the Empire's long history, with Corvain Thess, the elderly advisor who had first recognized what the silent ship truly represented, appointed to lead a new oversight council with actual authority to review annexations before they were quietly signed into law. Fleet Admiral Dorsa Vel, who had given the order to fire and watched it fail, without ever understanding why until Yuki explained it to her personally, requested reassignment to a newly created diplomatic liaison post, telling colleagues she no longer trusted herself to command a war she wasn't certain she believed in. Kest Orun, the border commander who had carried out the original detention without question, was quietly stripped of rank, not out of cruelty but because Thessaly herself insisted that someone had to answer for what had been done in the Crown's name, even as she privately acknowledged that the deeper failure had always been her own. And Yuki Tanaka, who could have returned home a celebrated hero, chose instead to remain aboard the Meridian's Grace alongside Elias Cho, continuing the quiet, unglamorous work of watching for the next isolated colony that might need 9 patient days and 1 unforgettable hour, content in the knowledge that the truest victories were rarely the ones remembered in monuments, but the ones that simply kept a little more cruelty from happening again. One empire, one throne room, one difficult choice at a time.